Full suspension setup is key for making your bike feel really balanced, making it feel good, but also giving you a bit of confidence riding it. So if you're new to full suspension bikes, you're coming off hardtail, or if you've got a bit lost with your setup, then I'm going to run you through my checklist and my tips for how to set up your full suspension bike. Number one, start with setting the sag of your bike, and we'll do fork and shock, but let's start with the shock. So most suspension shocks will have a rubber ring on them, which are really helpful for setting up your sag. So what you want to do is push that right down to the shock body, and then wearing all your normal riding gear. So if you're normally riding a big backpack or you've got stuff in there, whatever you normally ride in, get it on so that your weight is correct. And then lower yourself gently onto the bike, not holding onto the brakes. Basically sit down on your seat, put your feet up, and that should give you a sag measurement of, you know, when you're riding your bike, how much your body weight affects the rear shock. And my base setting is always starting around 30% sag. Some shocks come with like marks on them, so it makes it super simple. With this, it actually doesn't. So to get really accurate, I would have to get out some sort of tape measure. In fact, normally I do it by eye, to be honest. I'm looking for that rubber ring to be a third of the way along the stroke. And that looks about right to me. I've got an air fork and shock on this bike, so to adjust the sag, you'll need to get yourself a shock pump. So super simple. You can add or take some away until you get that about right. Like I said, I'd always start with 30% sag on the shock. It's worth noting that different shocks, different frame brands will need different amount of air in there to get the same amount of sag. So whilst you could compare yourself to your friends, if you say, oh, I've got 150 PSI in my rear shock, what have you got? It only works if they're running the same shock and the same frame as you. And obviously, if they're the same weight as you, it helps as well. If you've got a coil shock, so not many bikes these days, some downhill bikes will have them, it's slightly more involved to try and find the sag, because then you need to get the measurement basically from eye to eye of the shock when it's got no weight on it, and then when you're in sag, work out what the difference is. You need to get 30% difference, obviously. And if you need to change that, then you can wind more preload onto the coil, but only so many turns. If you have to wind it lots and lots, then you're gonna have to go up to a heavier spring. Similarly, if you're not getting enough sag, you might find you need to get a different spring, a lighter spring for that shock. Okay, to find the sag for your fork, it's similar, but slightly different, I would say. So again, try and use a rubber ring if you've got one. Slide it right down to your seal. Now what I'll do is I'll get up really gently onto the bike, and I'll actually roll along with my weight, just with my shoulders just level with the bars, no further forward. So I'll roll along, and then I'll be really careful not to touch the front brake, and I'll get myself off the back of the bike and use my back brake to stop. If you touch the front brake, it's going to make everything dive, and it'll give you the wrong reading for your sag. So, like I say, gently get up, get into quite an aggressive position on the bike. Forks will go in, and then roll off the back, so you don't bob it too much. And then that's your sag measurement. With a fork, I'm actually looking for less than 30%. I go for about 25, but I would say anywhere between 20 and 30% sag on the fork is about right. Like I say, mine is always 25, and that suits me pretty good. With your sag set correctly, you should find your bike feels pretty balanced straight away. Nice small bump sensitivity, so when you're riding over the little chattery stuff, your bike's working really well to smooth those out. But also on the bigger hits, your bike isn't feeling too soft and wallowy. If it isn't, then wait for my next tip. Progression. Thanks for waiting, by the way. So one of the main advantages of using air suspension, well, it's lighter, but also you can adjust the progressivity of that suspension. So if you've got your sag set correctly, but maybe you're still bottoming out quite hard, maybe you're an aggressive rider, you can then think about making that shock or that fork more progressive. So the further it goes into the stroke, the harder it then gets to compress. So you still get the advantage of the small bump sensitivity. So you're not putting any more air in, you're just reducing the volume of the air inside that unit, therefore it ramps up quicker. So it's the best of both worlds. I quite often do that. It depends on the bike. Some bikes are more linear, more progressive than others, just their frame layouts give them different suspension curves. But quite often I will put a shock spacer in to make that bike a bit more progressive. Like I said, you keep the small bumps, but you also, you know, you can thrash that bike a bit harder, I would say, without getting the really hard bottom outs. Or for lighter, maybe less aggressive riders, you might want to go the other way. Maybe you've got 30% sag on the shock, but you're then never bottoming out of that shock. Then maybe you can take some spaces out of that shock so you can use all of that travel. So it's not one setup suits everybody, and you might want to change this depending on the season or how hard you feel you're riding your bike. But same goes for an air fork. You can change how progressive they are. Now getting into the clickers, so the more adjustments you can make to your suspension. So most forks and shocks have a rebound adjuster, and as you might have guessed, it controls how fast it rebounds after being into its travel. And as a general rule of thumb, I like my bike slightly slower on the back and slightly faster on the front, and this is where I get into sort of a bit of trial and error. What I will say is, especially Fox and RockShox, but most manufacturers have really good guides on their website. So if you search their websites for the shock or fork that you have, it'll give you a base setting. And I still do that every time when I get a new bike. I will set my clickers, and they normally give you like it tells you to wind the rebound all the way in, and then it'll be X clicks out. So 6 clicks out from all the way in, or 8, or whatever it is, depending on how much air you put in and your weight as well. And that's a great base setting. From there, I do tend to play around a little bit and experiment, but I will only ever go to 1 or 2 clicks at a time. So I can then try it, and if I don't like it, go back, rather than do loads and loads and then think, oh, I'm lost where I am now. So experiment a bit with your rebound. Like I said, I'll go to the base settings, try and keep my fork a little bit quicker than I am on the rear shock, because I like that rear end to be slightly more predictable, but definitely experiment. Some suspension also has compression damping. So basically, you know, as you're compressing it, if you put more compression damping on it, it basically makes that fork feel a bit harder. Gets slightly more complicated when people like Fox, with my 38 here, have a high speed compression and a low speed compression. However, it is very useful once you understand what they do. And again, experiment a bit with them, go from the base settings, try them out. So low speed compression is more about sort of big G outs, quite often in a berm or something like that, where you're squashing into it. If you feel like your bike is going in too deep into the travel, particularly on one end or the other, if you're hitting those big berms and G'ing out, but your fork's going in quite far, but your shock isn't, and that's where I'll put a bit more low speed compression damping onto my fork. See how that feels? A couple of clicks at a time. And then high speed, that's more about the fast hits, the big hits. So if you're doing a big drop off to flat and your fork is then bottoming really hard, then put a bit more high speed compression on there. If it's not going in far enough and it feels too hard, then take a bit off. But definitely experiment with these things. Most full suspension bikes get chain growth. So as the bike goes into its travel, it actually stretches the chain. So you can see my Met cage go forward a little bit, not a huge amount on this bike. So it's well worth checking your chain, especially if you're swapping the chain out for a new one. Don't just assume that your old chain is the correct length. If it's too short, it will actually restrict the suspension, but more than that, it will probably snap your chain or even break your mech, because if that's too tight and then it stretches, it will break it. I've done that before. So bear that in mind also. If you maybe snap your chain on the ride and you have to shorten it a little bit, try not to shorten your chain too much, because eventually it'll get too short and it will break. The way to check this is to make sure that your chain is up in the biggest sprocket on your cassette. Let the air out of your shock and then push the shock all the way in until it bottoms out, and make sure that your chain isn't too tight. See, that is quite tight, but I still have a bit of slack in there so it won't snap the chain. You need to regularly check the bearings on your rear suspension as well. When they get wet, rusty, it starts to get stiff, it will really affect the way your bike feels, particularly on the small bump stuff. It feels like it goes completely rubbish, like your bike doesn't work. On the bigger hits, it still normally moves. So make sure you're checking them fairly regularly. Bikes have got way better, I would say, in the last few years at sealing themselves. So, you know, they really should last at least a year. If you're riding somewhere like the UK where they're getting wet and horrible after a year, I still think they should last a year. But keep an eye on them. Quickest way of checking them is to grab your rear wheel. Make sure your rear wheel is tight into the frame, but give it a wobble. If there's much movement you can see in the back end, that's the surefire sign basically that your bearings are on their way out. you can definitely get a bit more in depth than that. So think about taking your shock out and then just removing the rear wheel as well and cycling that rear suspension. As soon as you take the shock out, you'll get all the movement, and sort of put your finger next to that bearing as you do it. And if you feel any sort of grinding or rumbling from that bearing, then that's going to need replacing. You can also keep on top of making sure they're greased. So if you get like a Stanley blade or a pick, and if you really carefully remove the seal on the bearing, then you can spray a bit of degreaser in there, clean them out, get all the muck out. You'll be able to tell straight away. If it's still looking nice and clean in there, then it's probably in great condition. Then I would just put a bit more grease back in there straight away. Whereas if it's a rusty brown, that water's got in there and it's horrible, you're gonna have to give it a good clean out with degreaser, dry it out, and then re-grease it. But also, at that point, I would start thinking about getting a new bearing kit to make your bike feel new again. Check the condition of your stanchions on your fork, but also on the rear shock. If there's any scratches or if there's any oil on that shaft, then that does mean that it'll need servicing. It doesn't really happen very often again these days, to be honest. They normally, if you keep them nice and clean, like I do, after I've washed a bike, I'll make sure that stanchion's nice and clean and put some suspension lubricant on there. Definitely helps them out. Then they should stay in good condition. Also keep an eye on shock bushes. So I've actually got bearings on these eyelets, but some bikes, they have, I think it's nylon shock bush that goes in that eyelet of the shock where it mounts to the bike, and they can wear out after a while, so they'll get rotation through them. Again, a bit like checking your bearings. If you just pick the back end of a bike up and put your finger sort of on the linkage and on the shock, if you're bouncing it around, if they need replacing, you will feel the movement on your finger. Like I say, these are bearings and they actually feel really good, but shock bushings, super cheap, and they need replacing quite often. As far as official service intervals go, well, Fox say every 125 hours or yearly, whichever comes first. I don't track how many hours I ride a bike. You might be able to do that if you're using a bike computer. Otherwise yearly, and that does decrease if you're riding in extreme conditions, in dust or in the desert or in extremely wet conditions, then that will decrease, but about a year. It's worth looking into the tech that your bike has as well. Some have lockouts on their forks and their shocks. Some are remote, so they're up on the bar, so you can flick them as you ride along. If I'm honest, I very rarely use them. I never use them on a fork. Sometimes I'll use them on a shock. If I'm out somewhere with a massive climb, which isn't the UK, because I don't tend to have massive climbs, then if I'm riding up a road for half an hour, then I will firm up that rear shock. So it will help it pedal a bit better. But to be honest, in the UK, I generally leave those on open all the time. And if I can, I try and remove the lockouts from the bars just to clean it all up, because I don't use them that much. There you go, there's some of my full suspension setup tips. Hopefully your bike will then feel good out on the trail. For me, I notice it, I'm trying to think about it all the time, but sometimes in corners, if I've got a flat corner and my bike doesn't feel balanced, like the front wheel slides more than the back wheel, then I'll think about, what's my fork doing? Is it maybe going in too far and it's dropping my weight forward? I'll then maybe think about adding a couple of low speed compression clicks on there to keep it a bit higher, keep the bike balanced. Also, through bumps, if I'm pumping hard or if I'm just bottoming out, using a lot of travel, does the bike feel the same front to rear? So try and think about it a little bit on your ride. Like I said, it might be a case of messing around with how progressive suspension is to make it feel good. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments down below. I'll try and jump in and answer them if I can. Don't forget to head over to GMBN Tech with Anna and Doddy. They've got loads and loads of in-depth videos on how to set up your bike, so you can get it dialed and get out there enjoying it, I hope. So yeah, give a thumbs up if you like this video.